She was just a technician. They laughed at her and wouldn't let her fly until one of the soldiers saw the tattoo on her neck. What was revealed after that turned the whole base upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun was unforgiving in this part of East Africa. It didn't shine. It scorched. By midday, the ground shimmered with waves of heat rising off the tarmac, and even the hardened soldiers on the remote American military base sought refuge in shadows that barely existed. Metal warped beneath the sun, plastic softened, and the dry wind carried fine, biting sand into every corner of the compound. There was no such thing as silence here. Even when the engines stopped and the radios quieted, there was always the wind, scratching, whispering, stinging. Raina Marsh moved through this world like a shadow. She wore a standard-issue tan jumpsuit, one size too big, and heavy boots that left deep prints in the dust. On paper, she was a civilian contractor assigned to drone maintenance. In reality, she was an invisible presence, a body taking up space that no one bothered to look at directly unless it was to sneer or dismiss. She kept her head low, worked through the heat, and spoke only when necessary. Days bled into each other in an endless cycle of sweat, dust, and mechanical parts. The hangar where she worked was on the far end of the compound, past the barracks, past the administrative trailers, right next to the perimeter fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Inside, it was sweltering and poorly lit only by narrow shafts of light through broken slats. Raina worked in silence with nothing but the high whine of damaged drones and the clink of metal for company. When the others left for mess or shade, she remained. There was always something to fix. Broken wings, failing sensors, burnt wiring. She kept her hands busy, her head down, and her voice inside her. The others noticed her only to mock her. Some called her the mute tech. Others used sharper words, sneaky bitch, desert rat, waste of a paycheck. They laughed when she passed, sometimes loud enough for her to hear, sometimes in whispers they thought she wouldn't notice. They asked where she was from like it was a joke. When she didn't answer, they made assumptions. Africa, the streets, prison. One man had once joked that she was probably a witch, burned her voice out of herself. She never corrected them. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, turning the sand orange and casting long shadows over the compound, Raina carried a crate of salvaged drone rotors back toward her hangar. Her arms ached, her shirt clung to her back with sweat, and the wind had begun to pick up again. She passed a group of soldiers near the water tanks. They were laughing about something, leaning against the metal and smoking. One of them, a corporal with a sharp jaw and eyes too narrow to trust, glanced at her and smirked. "Hey, drone queen," he said loud enough to echo. "Smile for us, huh?" The others laughed. Raina said nothing. She kept walking, boots crunching gravel. "She don't talk 'cause she's too dumb to form words," someone muttered. "Or she's got something to hide," another added. "Bet she's in witness protection or some shit." As she disappeared into the hangar, their laughter faded behind her. She set the crate down, her arms trembling slightly, then took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Her fingers trembled from fatigue, but she forced them to stillness. On the far wall, pinned to a makeshift corkboard, was a photo. A black and white image of a younger woman with sharp eyes and a crooked smile. The woman wore a combat medic uniform and a medal gleamed at her collar. Raina looked at it for a long moment, then turned away and returned to her workbench. That night, she didn't return to her assigned room. She slept in the hangar, curled up under a half-covered drone wing, using a rolled-up jacket as a pillow. It wasn't unusual for her to do this. The others assumed she was strange, maybe paranoid, maybe just antisocial. No one asked why, no one cared to, but they noticed the tattoo. It happened during the weekly rotation of showers when Raina was forced to use the communal facilities due to a water cut in her corner of the base. She wore a towel and moved quickly, eyes down, but as she turned her back to reach for her clothes, one of the younger privates saw it. A black hawk, wings outstretched, talons curled around a silver blade, inked into the skin of her upper neck, right below the hairline. He blinked, stared, then quickly fumbled with his phone. Later that night, a grainy, poorly lit photo of Raina's back circulated in one of the soldiers' private group chats. At first, they laughed at how bony she looked, how odd her posture was. But then came the questions. What's that tattoo? Looks military? Special ops? Nah, no way, she's a nobody. The debate spun into theories, some ridiculous, others chillingly close to the truth. But it didn't matter. By morning, half the base had seen it, and Raina knew it. She moved even quieter than before, her shoulders tighter, her hair tied lower to try and conceal the ink. But it was too late. The laughing behind her wasn't just about her silence anymore. It was about secrets. At breakfast, no one sat near her. At lunch, no one acknowledged her. She worked in total isolation, and though nothing had changed physically, everything had shifted. She had become something they didn't understand, and that made her dangerous in their eyes. The wind grew harsher that week. Dust storms rolled across the plains and slammed into the base without warning. Sand got into everything. Machinery, lungs, food. Raina didn't complain. She wrapped her scarf tighter, goggles pulled low, and kept working. She wasn't here to make friends. She wasn't here to explain herself. She was here because she had nowhere else to go, and because, deep inside, something in her waited. The drone she was secretly restoring was an older model, long since decommissioned and left in a corner of the hangar beneath a dusty tarp. Its systems were fried, batteries corroded, and one wing was split near the root. But she remembered this model. She had flown it once, long ago in another country under another name. She knew its secrets. Each night, after the others had gone, Raina worked on it slowly, carefully, piece by piece. She cleaned the boards with vinegar and cotton swabs, soldered new paths by hand, rewired the radio link. She scavenged parts from damaged drones, rewrote code, and tested engines in silence. She kept a map on the wall, partially hidden behind a tool rack. It marked crash sites, radio dead zones, old evacuation corridors. She didn't explain the markings to anyone, but she studied them every day. No one asked questions. No one looked twice. She lived inside herself like a locked room. The days passed. The base grew tenser. Rumors of attacks nearby, bombings, road ambushes. Patrols went out and came back missing soldiers. Tension crackled in the heat. Command grew colder, tighter, more rigid, but no one asked Raina to help. No one even thought of her when they discussed logistics or defense. She was invisible again, but the tattoo stayed in their minds. That night, after a particularly brutal sandstorm, Raina sat alone in the hangar. Her hands were black with grease, her face streaked with sweat and dust. The decommissioned drone's eyes flickered once, its systems responding to power for the first time in years. She looked at it without expression, then leaned back against the wall, pulled the photo of her sister from her pocket, and stared at it until her eyes burned. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, there was only dust and silence. The days that followed the sandstorm settled into a tense rhythm. The sky cleared, but the air remained heavy, as if something unspoken hung over the base. Soldiers walked faster, spoke quieter. Even the officers, usually loud with their authority, moved with sharper eyes and clenched jaws. Rumors were no longer whispered. They were acknowledged in grim nods and hastily written memos. Several outposts nearby had been hit. 2 supply convoys went missing. A patrol never returned. Something was tightening its grip on the region, and everyone knew it. Reyna sensed the shift like a change in barometric pressure. The atmosphere pressed harder against her skin. Her silence no longer made her invisible. It made her suspicious. She could feel it in the sideways glances, the sudden hush when she entered a room, the lingering stares at the back of her neck. They weren't just mocking her anymore. They were trying to decipher her. But Reyna didn't flinch. She didn't adjust. She moved through the growing tension with the same measured pace, the same mute focus. Only in the hangar did she allow herself breath, even if that breath was shallow. The map behind the tools now had new markings, hand-drawn circles, arrows, and dotted lines. She studied it often, hands on her hips, eyes narrowed. One night, she spent 3 hours cross-referencing old radio frequencies, tuning into static and fragments of intercepted calls. She logged everything into a battered notebook she kept zipped in her coveralls. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. In the daylight, the base swirled in barely contained anxiety. Extra drills were ordered. Emergency stockpiles were reassessed. Command began issuing vague but urgent directives. Double patrols, fortified watch posts, clearance checks. Reyna received none of them, of course. Officially, she was beneath the threshold of strategic usefulness. No weapon training, no deployment status, no clearance for active missions. But late one evening, she was given an assignment: cleaning out the back inventory of the mechanical shed, the place where unsalvageable parts were dumped and forgotten. It was supposed to be punishment, though no one admitted it aloud. Maybe they assumed it would break her back or her will. Reyna accepted the task without expression. She moved boxes of rusted rotors, cracked lens arrays, batteries swollen from heat. Dust clung to her skin and filled her lungs, but she worked until the shed was cleared and swept. At the bottom of one forgotten crate, she found the shell of a flight control unit from a now-defunct aerial drone, a model she hadn't seen in years. She held it in her hands, inspecting the circuitry, noting the damaged chips and discolored boards. The unit was beyond repair, but the casing told her something else. It had once belonged to a classified aerial recon unit, the kind used only in Black Ops missions where deniability mattered more than survival. She tucked it into her tool bag without a word. The pieces were aligning. She returned to her drone project, working faster now. Her movements were sharper, her decisions more precise. She adapted old components, bridged software gaps with rewritten firmware, and restructured the flight logic from scratch. Every night, she ran diagnostics, fine-tuned servos, and calibrated sensors. Her hands became extensions of the machine, precise, tireless, unwavering. But even as she worked, the base pressed harder against her. One afternoon, after returning from a supply run to the storage depot, Reyna found her workspace in disarray. Her tools were scattered, drawers left open, wires tangled like spilled intestines. Her notebook was gone. Her drone, covered hastily with its tarp, had one of its wing flaps damaged, bent unnaturally backward as if kicked. She stood over it for a long time, jaw tight, heart still. There was no doubt who had done it. There were only a handful of people who knew where she kept her things. Fewer still who had the access code to the hangar. but Reyna said nothing. She knelt, inspected the damage, then rolled up her sleeves and began the repairs. That night, she found her notebook tossed behind the waste bin, stained with oil and ripped along the spine. She wiped it clean, taped the pages, and kept writing. The wind returned the next day, hotter and heavier than before. The air shimmered even at dusk, and the base seemed to shrink under its weight. Fights broke out more often. Small things at first, a snapped insult, a shoved shoulder, but it was building. The fear was growing louder than the discipline. Reyna felt it all but said nothing. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she stood at the edge of the perimeter fence, staring out into the flat, empty desert. Somewhere out there, people were moving. Men with weapons and rage, riding in modified trucks and calling themselves liberators or martyrs. Reyna knew that kind of war. She had seen what it did to cities, to families, to children, to people like her. The next morning brought the letter. It was folded in half, hand-delivered in a brown envelope marked with the insignia of a legal office in Virginia. The paper inside was impersonal and cold. The appeal for posthumous honors for her sister had been rejected. The wording was careful but decisive. Insufficient evidence. Unverifiable conduct. Possible deviation from protocol. The implication was unmistakable. Her sister had been labeled insubordinate. Her refusal to abandon wounded civilians during a failed extraction had been twisted into negligence. Reyna stared at the letter for a long time. Her hand trembled only once, and then it steadied. She folded the paper slowly and slid it into the breast pocket of her coveralls. By sunset, the base was in full pre-alert mode. A satellite sweep had detected unusual movement 20 kilometers west. Thermal signatures, dust trails, possible convoy formations. Patrols were called in. Armory checks were run. A briefing was scheduled at midnight. Reyna wasn't invited. Instead, she returned to the hangar and finished soldering the last chip into place on her restored drone. The power system activated without hesitation. The rotors spun briefly, then settled. The drone's eyes blinked to life, a soft green glow behind protective glass. She stood in the quiet, staring at the machine. Her hands were black with carbon dust, her arms aching, her eyes dry. But inside, something shifted. Not relief, not triumph, something else. Readiness. There was a reason she had not run, even when the laughter turned to mockery, even when the threats were no longer implied but lived in the creases of every stare. There was a reason she had kept her silence all these years. Not because she feared what they might learn, because she knew they wouldn't understand. But war always exposes what peace tries to bury. And the sand was shifting again. At 3 a.m., the sirens blared, not for a drill, not for practice. An Allied transport plane had gone dark over the desert. No communication, no GPS return. Last contact placed it within the kill box of a local militant faction. 3 officers were aboard, including a regional intelligence chief. Rescue time was critical. The base scrambled to respond, but there was no one to fly. One pilot was on medical leave with a shoulder fracture. Another was grounded for an alcohol violation. The last qualified flyer was en route to a separate mission hundreds of kilometers away. Panic thickened in the command tent. Orders snapped through radios. Maps unfolded, timelines argued. 1 hour, maybe 2. After that, recovery would be a formality, and Reyna stood in the shadow of the hangar, watching the chaos unfold with quiet eyes. No one called her. No one even remembered she was there. But she remembered everything. She walked back to her drone, her restored ghost of war, and ran her fingers along its wing. Then she moved to the gear locker, retrieved the flight uniform she hadn't touched in 7 years, and began to dress. The night was alive with movement. Soldiers running, lights flashing, trucks rolling toward the runway, and in the middle of it all, Rayna emerged, helmet under one arm, keys in hand, jaw set. No one saw her at first. Then someone shouted, "What the hell is she doing?" Rayna didn't pause. She climbed into the cockpit of the drone's launch vehicle, ignited the system, and began pre-flight protocols. Voices shouted. Feet pounded toward her. But the engines were already screaming, the turbine winding up into a roar. She radioed into the tower. No request, no explanation, just coordinates. The runway lights flared, and then she was gone. The air outside the base was thicker than it had been all week, weighted with heat and the kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from something crouched and waiting. Rayna had felt it even before the sirens started, even before the briefing room flooded with boots and panic. She had tasted it in the dryness of her mouth and the way the light dimmed unnaturally under the desert sky, as though even the sun had chosen to retreat. Now, as the drone vehicle sped down the runway and lifted off the ground with a roar that sent waves of grit scattering from the tarmac, that silence erupted behind her in chaos and disbelief. She didn't look back. The launch was rough. The modified systems she had resurrected weren't designed for perfect aerodynamics, and the turbulence hit her like a punch to the chest. The cockpit shook, rattled. Lights blinked warnings she ignored. Her fingers moved over the controls with practiced precision, compensating for every shudder and lurch. Behind her, the base grew smaller, swallowed by the darkness and wind. She had flown worse before. She had flown damaged craft under artillery fire with wounded men bleeding out behind her. She had flown through electrical storms and heat waves and the screams of children she couldn't save. The sky had never frightened her. It was only on the ground that she learned fear. As soon as the aircraft stabilized, she keyed into the emergency frequency and listened. Static. Then, faintly, the clipped, panicked voice of a man calling coordinates, followed by a burst of background noise, gunfire, shouting, then silence. She replayed the last coordinates and plotted the route in her head. She was just under 90 kilometers away. At her speed, it would take less than 20 minutes to reach the projected crash zone. She pushed the throttle. Back at the base, command was frozen. Radios barked orders that went unanswered. Someone demanded to know who had authorized the launch. Another shouted over the din that the pilot was a civilian. By the time someone recognized her name, she was already too far gone to recall. The satellite feed blinked to life, tracking her position, and all the noise in the tent fell away. She was flying directly into hostile territory, but Rayna didn't care. She cut beneath cloud layers, skimming the desert like a shadow. The land below her was jagged and harsh, riddled with shallow gullies and sharp ridges that twisted like the broken ribs of some ancient beast. She moved with it, every shift of her hand matching the contours of the land, as though she was dancing with it instead of crossing it. As she approached the last known position of the downed aircraft, she killed the lights, dropped to low altitude, and scanned the terrain manually. The wreckage came into view just before dawn, a twisted shape half buried in sand, smoke rising faintly from its fuselage. 2 pickup trucks circled nearby, armed and moving erratically. They hadn't yet found the survivors. Rayna angled the drone's cameras and zoomed in. Heat signatures glowed inside the wreckage. 3. 1 was motionless. 2 were crawling, trying to stay hidden beneath the broken wing. A 4th figure lay apart from them, already still. She ran a silent calculation in her head. They had minutes. Switching controls, she adjusted the drone's defensive systems, activating a pulse jammer she had rebuilt from scavenged parts. The frequency was narrow, weak, but enough to disrupt the attackers' radios. The pickups began to swerve as static poured into their headsets. Reyna didn't wait for them to recover. She made a pass, fast and low, releasing a flare designed for evasion but modified for psychological effect, an old trick from her recon days. The flare exploded in a sharp, blinding arc, trailing noise and heat as it curved over the vehicles. They braked and scattered, momentarily blind. Reyna banked sharply and dropped a smoke bomb near the wreckage. Not a weapon, just cover. She set down the drone 300 meters out, hard and fast, the landing gear groaning in protest. The moment it hit dirt, she was out of the cockpit, sprinting through sand and smoke with a med pack and her sidearm, requisitioned months ago but never used. The two surviving officers saw her silhouette emerge through the haze and almost opened fire. She threw down the med pack and raised her hand, showing them her ID badge. They stared, confused, before recognizing her face, barely. One had seen her once in the canteen, the other not at all. She didn't waste time explaining. She helped the first onto his feet, an older man, chest bleeding and groaning. The second limped heavily on a sprained ankle, dragging a communication case behind him. She slung it over her shoulder without a word. Gunfire cracked behind them. They were being flanked. Reyna pulled them forward, ducking behind the shattered hull, checking angles. They had no time for subtlety. She keyed the drone's remote from her wrist console and activated its last functional system, a one-shot rear exhaust flare. It blasted sand and debris into the air like a miniature sandstorm. Using the cover, she shoved both men toward the aircraft. They stumbled, rolled, but kept moving. The gunfire stopped. Silence returned. She knew what that meant. They were repositioning. Reyna got them into the drone, secured the door, and threw herself into the cockpit. The engines were still hot, but warning lights flared red across the board. Hydraulic pressure low. One thruster misaligned. Electrical instability. She ignored them all. The engines screamed again as she lifted the machine back into the air. Below, the attackers opened fire. Rounds pinged off the hull. The drone wobbled, smoke trailing from its undercarriage. She forced it up anyway. The survivors behind her clung to their seats, wide-eyed and silent. One bled from the shoulder. The other held his comm case like a life raft. Reyna didn't look back at them. She kept her eyes ahead, jaw clenched. The drone climbed out of range, then turned east, back toward base. Back home, inside the command tent, the tension cracked when the radar confirmed movement. "Unknown aircraft returning," someone shouted. The commanding officer stormed to the console. When he saw the identification signature, his mouth fell open. Another officer stared at the screen in disbelief. "It's her," he said. She broke protocol. She disobeyed orders. She violated every standard rule of engagement. And she saved their men. The drone's battered silhouette appeared on the horizon an hour later, limping and trailing smoke. Every soldier on base was called to the runway for emergency medevac. They gathered without speaking, drawn by something they didn't understand, yet couldn't ignore. The aircraft touched down hard, skidding over the tarmac with a shower of sparks. The landing gear collapsed. The drone tilted dangerously but stayed upright. The ramp hissed open. Reyna emerged, covered in soot and dust, her helmet in one hand and blood on her sleeve. Behind her, the two officers stumbled out, leaning on each other, shielding their eyes from the sun. The medics ran to meet them. Everyone else stood frozen. The commanding officer approached, flanked by aides. He opened his mouth, searching for something authoritative, something righteous. But before he could speak, one of the old sergeants gasped quietly, eyes fixed on Reyna's neck. He saw the tattoo, the black hawk, the blade. He knew that mark. He'd seen it once, years ago, during a mission classified so high that most of it had been scrubbed from record. A reconnaissance unit so skilled, so lethal, they were whispered about more than spoken of. Operatives who didn't wear rank or speak names. Operatives who vanished. The sergeant stepped back. Everyone else just stared. Reyna said nothing. She walked past them all, back straight, eyes forward, leaving silence in her wake louder than any explosion. Inside the hangar, her drone finally powered down, its lights flickering out one by one, and the dust began to settle again. The silence that followed Reyna's landing hung heavier than the dust still swirling across the tarmac. No one moved. Soldiers, who'd never looked at her twice now, stood shoulder to shoulder, their helmets under their arms, eyes fixed on her soot-smeared figure walking calmly down the ramp. The two officers she had rescued were already surrounded by medics, carried away on stretchers toward the infirmary. But it wasn't them the base focused on. It was her, this mute, grease-stained technician they'd ridiculed, dismissed, and ignored. She moved past them all without acknowledging their stares, her expression unreadable, the old jumpsuit clinging to her frame darkened with oil, blood, and ash. Her helmet swung loosely in one hand, her steps unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Inside the hangar, the drone wheezed and hissed as it cooled. Engineers ran diagnostics and snapped photographs, stunned by the fact that the machine had even made it into the air, let alone returned with 3 lives intact. The modifications Reyna had made defied the manuals. Her alterations to the flight system bypassed protocols no civilian contractor should have had access to. One of the specialists whispered that she must have written her own firmware. Another shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't repair work, he murmured. This was resurrection. Outside, the commanding officer paced, hands on his hips, mouth pressed into a hard line. He had shouted orders the moment she lifted off. He had demanded a tribunal, disciplinary action, confinement. And then the feed came through. The satellite footage of the crash site, the body heat signatures, the gunfire, and finally, the drone's approach and impossible landing. He had watched in silence, arms crossed, lips tightening as Reyna, this woman he barely remembered seeing around base, executed a rescue with tactical precision that rivaled his most decorated pilots. She had returned from a mission she had no clearance to accept, bringing back not just personnel, but a mystery that no one in the chain of command had an answer for. When Reyna emerged from the hangar some hours later, cleaned and wearing a fresh uniform, she was summoned to the main operations tent. She went without argument, her steps as steady as they had been when she marched toward the downed aircraft. Inside, the senior leadership had assembled. Commanders, intelligence officers, logistics heads. Charts and satellite images littered the tables. The air was dry with the sharp scent of coffee, sweat, and tension. No one spoke until she entered. Then all eyes turned to her. The commanding officer cleared his throat and gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. "Reyna Marsh," he said, tone clipped and formal. "Civilian contractor, drone maintenance. Is that correct?" She gave a single nod. "You had no authorization to launch any vehicle, no flight plan, no mission briefing. You ignored restricted access protocols. You risked government property, disobeyed multiple regulations, and jeopardized diplomatic strategy. Another nod. And yet, he added after a pause, you succeeded where trained personnel failed. Silence thickened. No one knew what to do with her. Finally, one of the older intelligence officers leaned forward. He was quiet, pale-skinned, with a scar that ran from the base of his ear to his collar. He had not spoken since she arrived, only watched her with narrow, calculated eyes. Now, he cleared his throat and placed a small device on the table. He pressed a button, and a grainy freeze frame from the drone's onboard camera blinked to life on the central monitor. There it was, the inside of the cockpit. Reyna's head turned slightly, her hair lifted by the fan and exposed the base of her neck. The tattoo, the black hawk, the blade. Someone near the back of the room audibly gasped. Another muttered something under their breath. The man with the scar spoke softly. That symbol is not standard military. It belongs to a program that doesn't officially exist. Reyna said nothing. I've seen it once before, he continued, during a joint operation in northern Syria. Years ago, a team extracted 6 captives under heavy fire without backup, without air support. No casualties, no witnesses. The soldiers who survived called them ghosts. Now, everyone in the room was staring. Operatives from a unit known internally as ROI, the man said, reconnaissance, operational, intervention. They didn't wear rank or carry identification. They were used in situations the military couldn't afford to acknowledge, and they disappeared after an incident in South Sudan. Entire program was buried. Another pause. You were one of them. Still, Reyna didn't speak. Her face betrayed no emotion. The commanding officer looked between her and the others, jaw tight. Is that true? She met his gaze with quiet intensity. I was, she said at last, her voice calm and measured. But I'm not anymore. That single sentence carried weight. It settled into the tent like dust into old cracks. The room held its breath. The man with the scar leaned back and folded his hands. Why are you here? Reyna looked past them, through the canvas wall, as if she were seeing something miles away. Then she answered, I lost someone. They didn't follow the order to leave civilians behind. Neither did I. But they didn't come back. I walked away after that, found work as a technician, took what clearance I had left and disappeared. She turned back to the table. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to fix machines. The commanding officer rubbed his temples. You just led one of the most effective field rescues this base has ever seen. She offered no response. There will be a review, he continued, an investigation, possibly even a hearing. I know. But until then, he added, eyes sharp now, I need to know if another mission were to go sideways, if we found ourselves without options again, would you act? Reyna's expression didn't change. I'll do what needs to be done. The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshakes, no applause, just the quiet, unspoken knowledge that everything on base had changed. She left the tent as silently as she had entered. That night, she returned to the hangar. Word had spread. The soldiers who used to whisper now stepped aside when she passed. No one blocked her path. No one dared speak ill of her within earshot. The same men who once made jokes about her silence now watched her with a cautious reverence, the way one watches a storm gathering in the distance. Reyna didn't seek their eyes. She went back to work. The drone was unsalvageable. She stripped what she could, boxed parts for reuse, cleaned the workspace. The familiar repetition calmed her, the hum of electricity, the scent of metal, the quiet weight of solitude, this was where she belonged. Not on a podium, not in a file labeled exceptional asset. Just here, with machines. One of the young technicians, Jackson, maybe, or Miller, entered the hangar. He hesitated at the door. She didn't look up. "I wanted to say," he began, voice cracking, "I didn't know. I didn't." He stopped. She continued tightening a bolt. "If you ever need help," he offered, voice small, "I'd like to learn." She looked at him then, briefly, just enough to see that he meant it. "You'll need better tools," she said, handing him a wrench. He took it with both hands, as though it were a gift. By morning, she had cleared the drone completely. Only the skeletal frame remained. The map on her wall had new marks, notations of the crash site, the recovery route, the altered airspace. She logged everything in her notebook and filed it away. Outside, the base resumed its routines. Drills, briefings, patrols, but the tempo had changed. Reyna's name had become a caution and a myth. Some said she was a ghost from a forgotten war. Others insisted she was still active, embedded under cover. Everyone agreed on one thing. She had returned from a place most didn't survive. She walked the perimeter fence at dusk, wind whipping her hair, the sky wide and burnt orange. The desert didn't care who she was or where she came from. It only remembered those who endured. She stood still for a long time, not watching, listening, to the silence that no longer needed hiding. The morning came slowly, creeping across the horizon like a promise no one believed in anymore. The base stirred to life with the mechanical rhythm it had always known, doors opening, boots hitting gravel, static crackling on radios. But beneath the surface something had shifted. Not in orders or schedules, not in the posted rosters or supply lists, but in the way men carried themselves. In the way they looked at Reyna Marsh. She no longer walked unnoticed. The silence that had once isolated her now seemed to surround her like a barrier. Respected, even feared. No one approached her without reason, but no one mocked her either. The casual cruelty, the smirks, the muttered insults, they had evaporated as if wiped clean by a single act that no one could quite explain, but no one dared to ignore. She returned to her routines as if nothing had happened. In the hangar, she recalibrated motion sensors, replaced damaged fans, reinstalled firmware on surveillance units. She organized tools that no one else thought to touch. Each task was done with the same quiet precision that had always defined her. But now, those who passed the open hangar doors sometimes lingered for a moment, pretending to check something on their clipboards, stealing glances through the haze of heat and dust. Once, Reyna had walked this base like a ghost. Now, she moved through it like a weather front, silent but unmistakable, shaping the space around her. There were no medals, no announcements. The command never issued a formal report about the rescue. The officers she had saved were flown out within 48 hours, their wounds stabilized and their minds already swept into debriefings and national protocols. If Reyna had expected a commendation, it never came. But she hadn't. She had already earned something more permanent. Respect from those who mattered. It was a few days after the mission when a new routine emerged. At first, it was just one soldier, a wiry young private who lingered after delivering parts, asking questions about thermal regulation on old engines. Reyna answered without looking up. The next day, another one joined him, then two more. They never stayed long. A few minutes here, a brief question there, but over time they returned. They started helping with inventory. They swept floors without being asked. They organized bolts by size, rewound cables, watched as she repaired circuit boards. Raina never invited them. She never acknowledged them beyond a nod or a handed tool, but she didn't turn them away. By the end of the week, 5 of them were showing up every night after their rotations, sitting cross-legged on the floor or leaning against the wall, learning without asking to be taught. One evening, as the air cooled just enough for breath to feel bearable, Raina was finishing the assembly of a stabilization mount when a shadow fell across her bench. She turned slightly. It was Corporal Maddox, the same man who had once joked about her silence, who had snickered with the others when the photo of her tattoo had spread. He didn't speak right away. His uniform was wrinkled, his sleeves rolled up, sweat staining his collar. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I was wrong," he said finally. She didn't answer. "I didn't know what you'd been through. I didn't even think to ask." Still, she said nothing. He fidgeted. "But I watched you fly that machine. I watched you bring them back. And He stopped, swallowed. "I wanted to say thank you." She looked at him then, not with warmth, not with forgiveness, just clarity. "You don't have to believe in people to save them," she said. "You just have to believe they're worth the effort." He didn't answer. He just nodded and left. That night, Raina sat alone in the back of the hangar. The tools were packed, the lights dimmed. Outside, the desert wind sang softly through the wires of the fence. She pulled a small metal box from beneath a tarp and opened it. Inside was her sister's photograph. Creased at the corners, the smile faded with time. Next to it was a single patch, dark green fabric, stitched with a black hawk and silver blade. She ran her fingers over the patch. Earlier that day, a package had arrived from off base. No note, no return address, just the patch and a folded document. Posthumous recognition for her sister's bravery, signed and sealed. She hadn't asked for it. Someone else had. She closed the box and exhaled. In the days that followed, the base grew quieter in a different way. The anxiety that had once pressed down like a heat wave had lifted. People moved with purpose again. Patrols returned on time. There were no new attacks, no sudden alerts. But something deeper had changed. Soldiers began organizing training sessions using Raina's notes. The hangar, once isolated and half abandoned, became a secondary tech bay. Mechanics started citing her adjustments as field standards. Even officers began asking for her input. Not officially, not on paper, but they came. One morning, just before sunrise, she was approached by Lieutenant Rourke. He was young, clean-shaven, the kind of officer who still believed regulations were moral truths. He had avoided her for weeks. Now, he stood in her doorway holding a box. "This came from Central Logistics," he said. "It's yours." She took it silently and opened it on the bench. Inside was a fresh jumpsuit, black, reinforced, with her name stitched over the chest. Not civilian contractor, not drone technician, just Raina Marsh. Underneath it, folded neatly, was a file. Her reinstatement papers. Conditional, quiet, but real. She closed the lid. "I'm not rejoining," she said calmly. Rourke shifted. "You don't have to, but if it ever comes to it again—" "I'll do what needs to be done," she finished. He nodded and left. Later that afternoon, she pinned her sister's medal to the inside of her toolbox. Not to display, not to prove anything, just to remember. By the end of the week, the younger techs had taken over most of the daily maintenance. Raina oversaw their work but rarely stepped in. She spent more time observing, adjusting, allowing them to learn through failure. One of them, Private Herrera, showed a natural understanding of flight systems. Reyna gave him extra schematics and watched his hands closely. Another, Miller, struggled with patience but had a mind for logistics. She let him organize their inventory, teaching him structure without a word. She had become something more than she'd planned. Not a leader in rank, but one in practice. Not because she demanded it, but because others began to follow her rhythm. And yet she remained apart. She still slept in the hangar, still walked the perimeter at dusk. She still kept her own tools locked, her own map pinned behind the bench. She didn't laugh. She didn't joke. But when others came to her, they found something steadier than kindness: reliability. One evening, the wind turned cold for the first time in weeks. Rain was unlikely, but the air smelled different, like something new beginning. Reyna stood alone at the edge of the airstrip, her eyes on the sky. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled. Lights from the tower blinked, calling aircraft home. Behind her, someone approached. She didn't turn. "You ever think of leaving?" the voice asked softly. It was Jackson. He sounded older than he was. Reyna watched the clouds. "Sometimes," she said. "Why don't you?" She let the silence stretch. Then, "Because leaving means running. I've done that before. I won't do it again." Jackson stood beside her for a while, then nodded and left. She stayed until the last light dimmed. In the weeks that followed, her name became part of base memory. New arrivals were told stories about her before they saw her. Some believed she was a legend. Others didn't believe at all until they stood in her presence and realized legends don't always need noise to carry weight. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't seek recognition. But she had reclaimed something far more precious: her dignity. Her voice. Not loud, not public, but steady. She had come to the desert as a ghost. She stayed as something more. And when the next siren rose weeks later, cutting through the air like a blade, Reyna Marsh didn't wait for orders. She picked up her wrench and walked into the wind. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out our next videos and share this one with someone who needs to see it.